The year was 1868, and the plains had grown tired of men. Wind swept across the high grass, carried with it the smell of dust, cattle dung, and the faintest memory of rain that never came. On a lonely stretch of land 50 miles west of Fort Stanton, an old ranch stood with its timbers gray and sun-baked, as though the sun itself had sucked the life out of the boards. A windmill creaked lazily overhead, its blades whining against the eternal breeze. The house behind it slouched in quiet despair, the kind of place you'd swear had been abandoned if not for the faint curl of smoke rising from the chimney. Inside that crooked house lived Elias Boone, a man the townsfolk called the Ghost Rancher. He had not always been alone, but the years had seen fit to strip him bare. His wife, Sarah, had taken fever 10 winters past. Their boy, no more than 9, had been swept up in a Comanche raid 2 years after that, never seen again. Since then, Elias had turned his back on town, on God, and on every form of fellowship a man might crave. His only companions were his cattle, his rifle, and the bitter silence of the prairie nights. Elias rose with the sun, worked his land, and spoke not a word unless the soil itself required it. His hands were rough, his face lined like weathered bark, his beard long and streaked with white. Men who passed his place on the cattle trail would glance once and never twice, for there was something unsettling about him. They said he looked right through you. They said he hadn't smiled in 10 years. It was on such a day, hot, dry, and humming with cicadas, that Elias heard it. Hoofbeats, distant at first, like thunder rolling over a far ridge. His hand went to the rifle leaning against the porch rail, instinct still sharp despite the years of solitude. He squinted across the plains, eyes narrowing beneath the brim of his sweat-stained hat. 5 riders broke the horizon. Women, Apache women. Their horses were ragged, ribs showing beneath patchy hides, and the women themselves looked near spent. Shoulders drooped, hair wild from the wind. Yet there was pride in the way they sat their saddles, even with blood on their faces and dust caked to their skirts. Elias stiffened, rifle raised. Apache on his land meant trouble. Trouble always followed. He stepped forward, voice gravel rough from disuse. Not one step closer. The women slowed, reined their mounts in. The tallest among them, a woman with black hair braided tight and eyes dark as obsidian, swung down first. She held up empty hands, palms forward. Her voice carried across the dry air, strong though hoarse. We come with no fight. We seek shelter. Elias spat into the dirt. You'll find none here. The woman took a step, forward anyway. The others followed her lead, dismounting one by one. Their dresses were torn, their moccasins worn through. One carried a child's blanket, though there was no child. Another's arm was bound with rawhide, blood seeping through. They were a sight of sorrow and defiance both, standing in his yard like ghosts conjured from the desert. The tall one spoke again. My name is Naeli. These are my sisters. We have lost our people. Raiders came in the night, men from the north. We escaped, but they will follow. Elias kept his rifle leveled, suspicion etched into every line of his face. You'll ride on before they get here. That's my advice. Naeli shook her head slowly. We cannot ride on. We have nothing. No tribe, no husbands, no fathers. We are alone, without a man to claim us. Others will take us, use us, kill us. Her words cut through the air like a knife. Elias tightened his grip on the rifle. That's not my concern. Naeli's gaze did not falter. It must be, for we have chosen you. You will be our husband. The rifle wavered for the first time in years. Elias Boone, who had not felt surprise in a decade, found his heart jolt like a hammer striking iron. The silence that followed was heavy, the kind that pressed against your ears and made the world hold its breath. Elias lowered the rifle only a fraction, his eyes darting from one woman to the next. They stood firm, meeting his stare without flinching, as though they had already decided this was a place they would live or die. You've lost your senses, Elias muttered. His voice cracked with something he hadn't meant to let slip, fear, or maybe anger. 5 of you, 1 of me. You think I'll take you as wives? You think I'll just open my door and say, come in, eat my bread, bear my name? Naeli's chin lifted. Yes, The others murmured in their tongue, nodding with solemn agreement. One, younger than the rest with fire in her eyes, added in broken English, "Better die here than be stolen." Elias barked a laugh, dry and humorless. "You're mad, all of you." He turned, ready to send them on their way. But something in him hesitated. He had lived with ghosts so long, he had forgotten what it was to see the living stand unafraid in his yard. Yet here they were, starved, beaten, broken, and still demanding life. Something inside his chest twisted, something he didn't like. "You'll sleep in the barn," he said finally, voice gruff. "One night, then you ride." The women accepted without protest. They led their tired horses to barn, moving as though they had walked into their fate. Elias kept watch on the porch, rifle across his knees, muttering curses at himself under his breath. That night, the prairie sang with coyotes. The women huddled in the barn, whispering in their tongue, while Elias sat awake by the fire inside. He tried to convince himself he would drive them out at dawn, yet sleep would not come. He thought of Sarah, of their boy, of the way life had crumbled to ash around him. He thought of these women, clinging to him as if he were the last post standing in a storm. Near midnight, a sound carried across the land. Not coyotes, not cattle. Hooves. Many. Elias snatched up his rifle and crept to porch. Out there, beyond the fence line, shapes moved against the moonlight. Men on horseback, circling slow. Shadows whispered and vanished into the grass. Raiders. His stomach turned cold. They weren't after him. They were after the women. He sprinted to the barn, shoved the door open. The women rose to their feet instantly, eyes sharp, as though they had been waiting for this. "They've come," Elias said, voice low and hard. "You want to stay here, you'll fight." Naeli nodded once. "We will fight." The first torch sailed through the night like a comet. It hit the dry ground near the corral, flames bursting upward. Horses screamed, cattle bellowed. The raiders charged in with whoops and war cries, a half-dozen men hungry for blood. Elias fired first. The crack of his rifle split the night, dropping a rider clean off his horse. The women were quick behind him, knives flashing, bows drawn, voices rising in fierce defiance. Naeli herself loosed an arrow that thudded deep into a man's chest before he could hurl another torch. The fight was brutal, close, and fast. Elias moved with a steadiness he thought long gone, each shot finding its mark, each step measured. One raider broke through, lunging at the barn door with the blade raised high, only to be met by the youngest bride, who drove a pitchfork into his gut with a cry that echoed in the dark. Flames licked higher, smoke stung the eyes, and blood darkened the soil. The night became a storm of screams and gunfire until, at last, silence returned. The surviving raiders fled into the prairie, leaving their dead behind. Elias stood in the yard, chest heaving, rifle hot in his hands. Around him, the women gathered, some wounded, all alive. Their eyes burned with something he recognized, the will to endure. He looked at them, these strangers who had barged into his solitude, who had shed blood on his land as if it were their own. For years he had thought himself hollow, a man left to rot in silence. But as the fire crackled low and the bodies cooled in the dirt, Elias felt something stir in the ashes of his soul. For the first time in 10 years, Elias Boone did not feel entirely alone. Morning broke red and raw, as if the sky itself remembered the blood spilled in the night. Elias Boone stepped into the yard, his boots sinking in the dirt still darkened with stains. Crows circled overhead, picking at what the raiders had left behind. He shoved their bodies into a shallow trench and covered them with dry earth, muttering nothing, thinking everything. When he turned, the women were already at work. Naeli hauled buckets from the well with steady strength. The youngest, Tiva, gathered scattered fence rails and reset them with stubborn resolve. Another, whose arm was still wrapped in rawhide, crouched by the fire, grinding cornmeal into a paste. None asked his leave. None waited for him to tell them how or what to do. They simply claimed the land as if it were theirs now too. Elias scowled. He had meant to throw them out with the sunrise. But after the fight, after hearing their cries and seeing their blood on his soil, the words stuck in his throat. His house had been empty for so long, He could no longer tell where the silence ended, and he began. Now the sound of women's voices filled it, low songs, laughter, even arguments in their tongue, and unsettled him more than gunfire ever could. At breakfast, he sat apart at the table, chewing slowly while they ate on the floor near the hearth. Naeli broke the silence first. "You saved us," she said plainly. Elias grunted. "Save my cattle, more like raiders burn everything if you let him." "But you stood with us," she pressed, her dark eyes steady. He glared. "Don't make me into more than I am. I've no interest in playing husband." A flicker of something unreadable passed over her face, but she did not argue. Instead, she began to tell their stories. One by one, they shared pieces of what had brought them to his door. Families cut down in raids. Husbands slaughtered. Brothers vanished. One had lost a child, taken in the night. Another spoke of being traded like cattle, only to flee before the bargain could be sealed. Their words carried no self-pity, only hard truth. Elias listened against his will. Their pain was raw, and it pressed against the walls he had built inside himself. By the time they finished, he no longer saw them as a faceless band of intruders, but as 5 distinct souls bound by grief and fire. Still, he said nothing. He rose, took his hat, and went out to mend fences. Yet all day their voices haunted him. 3 days later, Elias hitched a wagon and rode into town for supplies. He would have gone alone, but the women followed like shadows, insisting they could not be left behind. Against his bitter judgment, he let them climb aboard. The town of Las Cruces was no stranger to hardship, but it was stranger still to see an old white rancher roll down the main street with 5 Apache women in his wagon. Heads turned. Men paused mid-spit. A card game outside the saloon froze in silence. The blacksmith stopped hammering, the clang dying mid-strike. "Hell's this," someone muttered. Old Boone lost his mind. Another hissed. By the time Elias reached the general store, a crowd had gathered. He strode inside, jaw tight, ignoring the stares. The women followed, heads high, their presence a defiance all its own. The storekeeper, a pale, thin man with watery eyes, narrowed his gaze. "Boone, didn't think you'd show your face here with them." Elias dropped a list on the counter. Flour, ammunition, salt, sugar. The man sneered, glancing at the women. "You brim here for trade or for shame?" A murmur rippled through the room. One of the younger wives, anger flashing in her eyes, stepped forward as if to speak, but Elias raised a hand. He felt the weight of every stare, the judgment, the disdain. For years he had wanted nothing to do with these people. Now, for reasons he could not name, he found himself standing between them and the fire of the crowd. "They're under my roof," he said slowly, voice low and cutting. "That makes them mine to protect. You got a problem with that? You take it outside." The room bristled. A man by the barrel shifted his coat, revealing the butt of a pistol. Elias's rifle came up smooth, practiced. For a moment, the air was razor thin, silence drawn tight like a wire about to snap. Then the storekeeper shoved the list back at him with trembling hands. "Take what you need and get out. But don't think the town will stomach this long." Elias gathered the supplies, his back straight, his heart beating harder than any gunfight he'd fought. As he loaded the wagon, the women climbed in without a word. Naeli's eyes lingered on him, unreadable as always. On the ride home, the youngest finally asked, "Why you do that? You hate us?" Elias kept his gaze on the horizon. "Didn't do it for you. Did it because I don't take kindly to men spitting on my ground." The women shared a look. They knew better. The ranch slept uneasy that night. The wind carried the smell of rain, but none came. Elias sat on the porch with his rifle, staring into the dark. The town's warning clung to him like a burr. He had lived long enough to know when trouble was brewing. Trouble came just before dawn. It started with the dogs barking. Then the thud of hooves, many this time. Shadows swarmed the horizon, torches burning against the gray of first light. The raiders had returned, and they had brought numbers. "Up!" Elias roared, bursting into the barn. The women scrambled, grabbing bows, knives, whatever they could. Naeli snatched a rifle Elias had left on the wall. checking the chamber like she'd held one all her life. The attack came hard and fast. Raiders swept through the yard, torches flung, arrows whistling. A bullet shattered the barn door. Elias fired back, each shot cracking through the chaos. The women fought beside him, fierce and unflinching. One raider set the barn ablaze, flames licking up dry timbers. Smoke filled the air. Cattle stampeded, smashing fences. The ranch was becoming a battlefield. Elias fought like a man possessed. His rifle barked, his fist struck, his boots drove into mud and blood alike. But even as they cut down raider after raider, the tide did not break. Then a scream tore through the fire. One of the brides, her name was Kiona, had been struck, an arrow deep in her side. She fell hard, blood soaking her dress. Elias reached her in time, dragging her back behind the water trough, hands shaking as he snapped the arrow shaft. Her face twisted with pain, yet she did not cry out. "You'll live," he growled, though he wasn't sure if it was truth or prayer. Naeli stood over them, firing shot after shot with calm precision. "We hold," she said. "We must hold." The battle raged until the horizon blushed with full dawn. At last, the raiders pulled back, leaving the ground littered with their dead. Smoke curled from the ruined barn. Cattle scattered into the hills. The ranch looked broken, but it still stood. Elias staggered to his feet, surveying the wreckage. His chest burned with exhaustion, his hands sticky with blood, his and theirs. He had not fought for land. He had not fought for cattle. He had fought for them. The women gathered around him, some wounded, all alive. Kiona groaned softly but clung to life. Naeli met his gaze, her eyes fierce even the ash and smoke. "You see now," she said. "We are yours and you are ours. Not by choice, by blood." Elias could not speak. His throat was tight, his heart louder than the morning wind. For years he had buried himself in silence, in solitude. Now the land itself seemed to demand he rise, fight, and live again. The prairie stretched endless around him, the sky vast and unforgiving. But for the first time, Elias Boone was not standing it alone. Dawn broke over the prairie with a silence, so deep it felt like the land itself held its breath. Smoke from the burned barn still hung in the air, twisting into the pale sky. Elias Boone sat on the porch, his rifle across his knees, his eyes red from a night without rest. The ranch was battered, fences broken, cattle scattered, and blood still staining the dirt where men had fallen. Yet the house still stood, and so did he. Behind him, the women moved quietly about their tasks. Naeli tended to Kiona, whose wound festered but had not stolen her life. Tiva and the others gathered tools, salvaging what they could from the wreck. No one spoke of leaving. They had chosen this ground. Elias rubbed a hand over his face, the grit of ash and blood still clinging to his beard. For 10 years he had lived with ghosts, his wife, his boy, the silence of an empty home. Now the ghosts had been replaced by flesh and fire, by women who demanded more of him than he had to give. He had resisted. He had scorned them. Yet when the flames rose and the raiders charged, he had fought like a man with something to lose. He wasn't sure when the change had happened, but it had. By midday, a rider came from the ridge. Elias spotted him first, a lone figure hunched in the saddle, a white rag tied to the end of a spear. He lifted his rifle, but Naeli's hand caught his arm. "Wait," she whispered. The rider drew close, and Elias saw he was an elder, his face carved with age, his eyes dark and heavy. He dismounted slow, leaving the horse behind, and stepped forward with open hands. "I speak for the ones who hunted you," he said in broken English. His voice carried no threat, only weary resignation. "They will come again, and they will not stop. Unless," his gaze turned to Elias, "unless you give them the women." The word struck like a hammer. Elias's jaw tightened, his finger brushing the trigger of his rifle. Behind him, he felt the women stiffen, their fear masked by pride. Naeli spoke before Elias could. "We are not theirs. We will not be given." The elder's gaze lingered on her. "Then you will all die. The man too. His land will burn. His bones will feed the prairie dogs." Elias rose slowly to his feet, his rifle steady. "Tell them this. They've already spilled enough blood on my ground. If they want more, they'll have to pay in kind." The elder studied him for a long moment, then nodded once, as if satisfied with the answer. Without another word, he turned and mounted his horse, vanishing into the horizon. The women turned to Elias. For once, no one spoke. There was no need. War was coming, and it would not be like the skirmishes before. This would be the end of it, one way or another. That evening they prepared. Elias taught the women how to load rifles faster, how to find cover, how to hold steady even when the world turned to chaos. In turn, they showed him Apache snares, how to weave branches to funnel enemies, how to use the land itself as a weapon. Together, they rebuilt the ranch into a fortress. Trenches dug, fences sharpened into spikes, barrels of water lined for fire. As the sun sank low, Elias sat with Naeli on the porch. The horizon burned orange, the air thick with coming storm. He thought of Sarah, of his boy, of all the years wasted in silence. For the first time in years, words rose in him unbidden. "You asked me once to be your husband," he said. Naeli's gaze held steady. "We did. I ain't a man fit for it," he admitted. "But I'll stand for you, for all of you. If that means fighting till I fall, then so be it." She did not smile. Instead, she placed her hand over his, rough against rough, and gave a single nod. It was more binding than any vow. Night fell heavy, and with it came the sound of drums in the distance. They came at dawn. Not a handful this time, not even a dozen. Scores of riders crested the ridge, their war cries tearing to the morning air. Spears and rifles flashed, torches waved high. The earth shook beneath the thunder of hooves. Elias stood in the yard, rifle ready, the women at his side. Smoke from the torches curled upward, turning the sky into a battlefield before the first shot was fired. "Hold," he muttered, his voice calm despite the storm bearing down on them. "Don't waste powder till they're close." The raiders poured into the valley, a tide of rage and hunger. Arrows flew first, slicing through the air. Then came the thunder of rifles. The ranch exploded into chaos. Elias fired steady, each shot deliberate, each man who fell buying another heartbeat. Naeli fought beside him, her rifle cracking in rhythm with his. Tiva darted between cover, loosing arrows with deadly precision. Even wounded Kiona held her post to the window, firing with teeth clenched against pain. The raiders pressed hard. They swarmed the fences, only to be met by sharpened stakes. They tried to burn the house, only to be doused with water from the barrels. For every one who fell, two more surged forward. The yard became a storm of smoke, fire, and blood. Elias felt the years fall away. He fought not as a tired old man, but as the father and husband he once had been, the man who had built this ranch with his bare hands. Each shot carried the weight of all he had lost and all he refused to lose again. At one point, a raider broke through, charging at Elias with knife raised high. Elias swung his rifle like a club, the crack of wood on bone echoing louder than the gunfire. Another came, and Naeli was there, her blade flashing, blood spraying across the dust. Still the tide surged. Bullets tore through the porch rail. Flames licked up the walls. Elias's breath came ragged, his shoulder bleeding from a grazing shot. He reloaded with trembling hands, his vision blurring from smoke and sweat. Then, through the chaos, he heard it, a horn, sharp and clear. The raiders faltered, their cries wavering. On the ridge, new riders appeared. Not Apache raiders, but townsfolk, men from Las Cruces, drawn by the smoke and thunder. Some came out of curiosity, others out of grudging respect. But they came armed and ready. The raiders, outnumbered now, began to fall back. Their war cries turned to shouts of retreat. One by one, they broke from the yard, galloping into the horizon. Elias stood panting, his rifle slack in his hands, the yard a graveyard of bodies and smoke. The ranch still stood, battered but unbroken. The townsmen rode into the yard, their eyes wide at the sight of the women standing beside him, bloodied but unbowed. One man spat, muttering, "By God, Boone, you turned your place into a fortress." Elias ignored him. He turned instead to the women. Naeli stood with her rifle smoking, her face streaked with ash and blood. Tiva leaned on her bow, exhausted but alive. Kiona, pale and shaking, still clutched her rifle like it was part of her soul. For a long moment, none spoke. The only sound was a crackle of dying fire. Then Elias cleared his throat, his voice rough but certain. "You came a skimmy to be your husband. I reckon I didn't understand what that meant till today." He looked at each of them in turn, his eyes softer than they had been in a decade. "But I see it now. I ain't just your husband. I'm your kin, and you're mine." The words settled over them heavier than any vow spoken in church. The women bowed their heads, not in submission but in shared acknowledgement. They had fought, they had bled, and together they had carved something no one could take. The townsfolk looked on, whispering, uncertain, but Elias didn't care. He had built walls around his heart, so high even God himself couldn't climb them. Yet 5 women had come and torn them down, not with force, but with need, with courage, with fire. As the sun rose higher, bathing the bloodied ranch in gold, Elias Boone stood with his new family. For the first time in 10 years, he was not just surviving, he was living, and the prairie, vast and unforgiving, bore witness to a man reborn.